what I'll be presenting today is a talk called Virtue, Social Stratification, and Well-Being, New Advances in Religion and Positive Psychology. So the outline of my talk, I'm going to focus on three virtues today that have been sort of in the purview of positive psychology. Sociologists, which is my main discipline, haven't really focused a lot on how virtues are related to well-being and applying sociological concepts in doing so. So I'm going to focus on humility, trust in God, or what we might call faith. And then I'm going to also present some preliminary work on gratitude to God in a student athlete population near the end of my talk. So what I hope today to bring is to share some sociological insights, in particular, thinking about the question of how does social stratification shape the relationship between religious virtues and well-being. And in particular, I'm really going to focus in on education. I'm going to focus in on race, probably to a lesser extent. But really to sort of focus on how, obviously the American society is stratified by social class, by race, by gender. And I think part of what the sociological perspective brings to the study of positive psychology is a study on how virtues may relate differently to well-being based on people's position in the social stratification structure that we have. So I'm going to present some results, and I think you'll see a fairly consistent pattern emerging. So the first study that I'm going to talk about is one that I did with Chris Ellison of the University of Texas, San Antonio, and Neil Krauss of the University of Michigan, both very well-respected religion and health scholars. And we looked at the virtue here of humility. What predicts humility? And we looked at how education and race might intersect with a concept that Neil Krauss coined called God-mediated control. So just to give a definition of humility, and I'll talk about how it was operationalized in a few slides. Humility is defined in part by the ability to acknowledge one's mistakes, one's imperfections, and one's limitations. So a humble person realizes that they are not entirely responsible for their own good fortune, which helps to sort of quell any inflated self-assessments. And so God-mediated control is a concept that Neil Krauss developed about 20 years ago and has really come to be a sort of a heavy-hitting variable in the religion and health literature. And this is defined as a collaborative relationship with God characterized by the belief that one is working together with God to solve problems that might arise. So not that God is fully in control of one's life, not that a human is fully in control of their own life, but that there's a collaborative partnership between a human and God to work together to solve any problems that might arise in a person's life. So people could feel more humble when they enter into a personal relationship with God, when they realize his superiority and influence in their lives, and when they experience a sense of awe. Right? So when a person feels reliant on or they feel awed by God, this really opens up a vast gap between their perceived ideal self and brings to bear a recognition of how much farther they need to go. Now, as I mentioned, part of what my research agenda does is it looks at how social stratification might play into the relationship between God-mediated control and humility. So here, we're going to look at race. So empirically, there's sort of a main association between race and humility. So racial minorities typically are found to have higher levels of humility. And this could be really indicative of a response to the experience of either perceived unfair treatment or poverty. Resilience has also been linked to greater humility. So groups that have experienced more discrimination and hardship over the course of their lives might show greater humility. We also know from the literature that African Americans in particular are more likely to believe in a personal God. So they're more likely to believe that God is an engaged, loving presence in their lives, and they're actually less likely to experience struggles, divine struggles, than white Americans. So God could be here an important source of hope in the lives of African Americans because of the historical struggles they've faced. So the strength and humility granted by God might just be more easily accepted in the lives of Black Americans. Now, turning to another dimension of social stratification that I'm going to focus on here, that of education. So people with less education, we know sociologically, tend to rely more heavily on religion in their day-to-day lives. And the perspective that sociologists have put forth is often called the deprivation compensation perspective, where religion is used to compensate for a lack of secular resources. So devoid of secular resources like wealth, influential social networks, social capital, right? People with less education could place greater stock on religiosity in the absence of these other secular resources. So it's possible that people with less education could profit from the sense of meaning and order that's generated through having a relationship with a divine being. So the belief in God-mediated control could essentially be more consistent with the lives of those with lower education. So we're also going to look here at, is the relationship between God-mediated control and hypothesized to be greater humility? Does this vary by education? In particular, is this effect stronger by those with higher education? So yeah, just to give you a sense of the data here. So I'm going to use this data set for a couple of different studies here that I'll talk about. So the data come from the 2013 Religion, Health, and Aging Survey. So this was a nationwide survey in whites and African Americans who were aged 50 and older. It's a 5-wave longitudinal study, but a lot of the virtue measures were added at the 5th wave. So at the 5th wave, we have about 1,500 older adults. It's roughly half white and half black. So this is a very rare in sociological research to have a nationwide survey that oversamples blacks to the extent that we can have a sample like this. So the first 2 studies that I'm going to present use data from the 5th wave of this collected in 2013. So I'll show you here the measures of humility from a very well-recognized scale in positive psychology that was just averaged into a mean scale. The same with God-mediated control, 3 measures that Neil Krauss developed through extensive qualitative research and that have been used. I rely on God to help me control my life. I can succeed with God's help, and all things are possible when I work together with God. So we see that education as well is just simply coded in years. How many years of education do these older adults have? And race is just a simple binary of white and black. So I'll show you first the results for education. So here what we do in figure 1 is we plot predicted humility scores at 4 different quantities of education. At 10 years of education, which would correspond to less than high school. At 12 years, which would be high school or equivalent. At 16 years, which would represent a college degree, and at 18 years, which would indicate the respondent had more than a college degree. And we do this here across 3 levels of God-mediated control: low, moderate, which is just simply the mean, and high, which is 1 standard deviation above the mean. So I'm going to draw your attention to 2 lines here on the graph. The dark gray line represents those with the lowest levels of education, and the black line here represents those with the lowest levels of education. So as we move from low God-mediated control to high God-mediated control here across the x-axis, the steepest rise in humility is among those with 10 years of education. Right? So the relationship between God-mediated control and humility seems to be stronger, right? Has a stronger positive slope for older adults with less education. In contrast, right, the green line and the black line, which show older adults with at least a college degree, we see here that the line is pretty flat. Regardless of whether they had low God-mediated control or high God-mediated control, their scores of humility were pretty similar, right? So we did see evidence here that the relationship between God-mediated control and higher humility was stronger among those respondents with lower education. We see a very similar pattern here for race. So we again see a positive interaction term coefficient, which means that the relationship between God-mediated control and humility is stronger among Black older adults. So again, here we plot this out to make this interaction term more visually appealing. So here we plot predicted humility scores for Blacks versus whites across those 3 levels of God-mediated control. right? So really here, the difference it stems from when we move beyond moderate God-mediated control, especially for Blacks. So the move from moderate God-mediated control scores to high God-mediated control scores for Blacks is associated with a rise in humility scores from about 18.95 to 21.04, right? So more than a 2-unit change in humility as we move from moderate to high God-mediated control for Blacks, right? So Black older adults, if we turn to the third set of bars, with high God-mediated control, also report greater humility than their white counterparts with high God-mediated control, on average about 1.5 units higher on the humility scale. Right, so again, we see evidence here that the association between God-mediated control and humility is stronger among Black older adults compared to white older adults. So it seems to matter more for those who have a sort of a disadvantaged position in the system of social stratification. So just to wrap up some results from the first study before moving to the second, God-mediated control is associated with higher humility for all groups, though we did see some contingencies. So I quoted here, and we quoted in the study, St. Thomas Aquinas, humility properly regards the subjection of man to God. Right, so for a human to be humble, according to Christian understanding, they must recognize themselves as an inherently valuable child of God. Right, our value as a person is ultimately given to us by God, just as our existence is granted by God. So humility really should be this natural byproduct of acknowledging the need to work in collaboration with God. Now, of course, as we saw with the findings, what really emerged was that the relationship between God-mediated control and greater humility was stronger for low status groups, in particular those with the lowest levels of education and Black older adults. And so what I think that, the sort of consistent pattern of moderation that we're seeing here for these low status groups really invites further reflection on the possible role of humility in potentially addressing other forms of inequality that exist, particularly surrounding health and well-being, which the next study will speak to. So the findings of this study really suggest that a collaborative relationship with God for those of a lower status could potentially be a mechanism to reduce educational and racial differences in virtue or in well-being. So again, we found support for this resource substitution perspective, where a lower education may prompt greater acceptance of God's role in human life. Same thing with racial differences, that Black older adults could potentially be more likely to recognize through God their inherent value as a person and have a stronger reliance on God in their daily lives, perhaps because of the marginalization they've experienced. So again, really kind of I think a study showing the intersection of positive psychology and sociology in predicting who has various levels of an important virtue like humility. So moving to the second study, this is a study using the exact same data set of the study I just provided, but this time looking at sort of, again, almost an understudied variable, certainly in sociology and even I think potentially in psychology, of trust in God or faith and education. And here we're actually going to look at differences in health outcomes. So I again collaborated here with Chris Allison and Neil Krauss. So trust, as I'm sure I'm not, saying anything terribly new here, but it's a primary component of faith, though it's not reducible to faith, right? So the notion of trust is both implicitly and explicitly present in theodicies because the answers they provide must be taken on faith alone. So in some cases, right, trusting God may require believers to wait on God or to engage in sort of patient engagement of prayer or other spiritual practices until a person gains a clearer sense of what God wants or what God wills for them. Trusting God also may prompt people to utilize a range of religious or spiritual coping resources that are available to them. But research on trust in God, like I mentioned, and well-being in particular, is sort of in its nascent stage. There was a paper a couple years ago in the journal Mental Health, Religion, and Culture that made a strong push towards studying this variable more. And so our paper here was partially a response to that. So the research question addressed in the second study is the relationship between trust in God and well-being contingent on education? So really, again, focusing on this dimension of social stratification. So again, when we think about status-based differences, less educated individuals are more likely to believe in divine involvement in their lives. We've seen numerous sociological studies that have made this claim, and again have drawn from this deprivation compensation or resource substitution hypothesis, that the less educated could benefit more from religion because education arguably already affords people access to many important resources. As I mentioned in the previous study, earnings, wealth, accumulation, financial security, social capital networks, perhaps also access to health and mental health care. So here, when it comes to trusting God, this cognitive belief could bring the less educated inner peace and confidence and allow them to place their hope in God's grace and blessing rather than to rely solely on other humans or on the provisions provided by the social world. So confronted with higher amounts of pain and stress and suffering in the world, the vulnerability of not having definitive questions as to why this happens could potentially be assuaged among the less educated through placing their trust in God. It also could be, if we think about the perspective of a higher educated person, they may be more likely to dismiss the idea that God continually intervenes in the world because perhaps having more earthly goods leads one to dispel the idea that God's intervention is a necessary component for health and for well-being. So less educated individuals, again, could rely more on God, could place greater trust in God as a way to compensate for any shortcomings in their ability to reason through the various intricacies of life. So the data, again, come from the exact same wave. Dr. Krauss added many virtues to the fifth wave of the study. And again, oversampled Blacks, giving us sort of unprecedented data on this topic. So here we use an 8-item CESD depression scale as a measure of health. We just simply ask, people were simply asked, how would you rate your health from poor to excellent, a very standard measure. There was 5 measures for trusting God that are there on the screen. And again, education was coded in the exact same way in years. So here are the results. Again, I show them graphically just for ease of presentation. So we see kind of a similar pattern emerge here where the relationship between trust in God and lower depressive symptoms is stronger or amplified for individuals with 10 years of education, represented here by the black line in the graph. So again, this would correspond to less than a high school diploma or equivalent. Right? Again, for individuals with 16 or 18 years of education, which would correspond to a bachelor's degree or higher, the relationship between trust in God and education was fairly flat. Again, the green line and the dark gray line here, suggesting that increases in trust in God are not associated with an accompanying decrease in depressive symptoms. Right, so pretty striking patterns there with, really the strongest negative slope between education and depressive symptoms shown for those who have higher trust in God. Very similar results for self-rated health. So what I've graphed here on the y-axis is the probability of being in excellent self-rated health. So that's the highest category of self-rated health. And here, high trust in God was more strongly associated with a higher likelihood of being in excellent self-rated health for those with 10 and 12 years of education compared to those with 16 or 18 years of education. Right. So, for instance, I'll point out a few statistics here that I think are interesting. Among respondents who had 10 years of education, those with high trust in God reported a 73% chance of being in excellent health, compared to only 30% if they had low trust in God, represented by the black bars in the graph. right? The well-educated seem to have a fairly high likelihood of being in excellent health if they had high trust in God as well, but the difference in likelihood is just less among the better educated, right? So it's not that trusting God doesn't matter among those with higher levels of education. It's simply that it matters more for those who have lower levels of education. So just to put these findings into context, there again was a main effect. Trust in God was linked to better mental and physical health, again, in the full sample, right? So this is not to say that the educated received no benefits from placing trust in God. However, trust in God, if we think about it as a spiritual resource, was more consequential for the mental health and physical health of the less educated. So to pull sort of a very well-known verse from scripture, from the Gospel of Matthew, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. So if we translate this to sociological theory, right, we can say that trust in God as a virtue, as a religious resource, can really compensate for deficits in earthly resources, at least when it comes to predicting health and well-being. So trust in God could present a vicarious sense of hope for the less educated when they're facing stressful challenges that might otherwise undermine well-being. And it's been argued by Neil Krauss and others that religious coping strategies, turning to one's faith in times of difficulty, seeking out help, perhaps from a religious congregation, a religious leader, turning to scripture and prayer, all sorts of religious coping strategies that have been the topic of research for many years, could be a manifestation of trusting in God. So in sum, I think the central contribution of this second study is simply giving some attention to the virtue of trusting God and faith and its salubrious connection to well-being, but also to, again, demonstrate this consistent role of social stratification in impacting the relationship between virtue and well-being. In particular, right, this relationship between trusting God and well-being being amplified or stronger, mattering more for those in lower socioeconomic positions. And so it's our hope that the literature on trusting God, which is an important religious cognition, resource, and virtue, continues to grow, and that dimensions of social stratification are extended to also include race, gender, income, perhaps neighborhoods that people live in, to sort of push this empirical agenda forward. Okay, for the third study that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. So hopefully you'll find this interesting as well. This is somewhat of a new and emerging line of work for me, sort of very, very early stages for me at this point. This paper that I'm going to present here is currently under review with some collaborators, both in psychology and education at Baylor University. So what I want to do here is focus on a sort of population that's been identified as vulnerable to mental health problems in an educational institution. So with my interest in education, focusing here on a group of student athletes who are a group that's been identified by the NCAA and by other researchers as at a higher risk of mental health problems compared to the college population at large. So currently, estimates suggest that about 1 in 5 student athletes suffer from clinical depression, oftentimes undiagnosed. And so if we think about what the lives of student athletes entail with great levels of training, travel, competition, while also being full-time students with pressure to win, to keep scholarships, now increasingly in the world of name, image, and likeness, and the transfer portal, right? They're a very vulnerable group. And so what this study really asks is, can religious virtues help student athletes deal with some of the stressors that they face? So this study that we have here focused on gratitude to God, which is defined as feelings of thankfulness from receiving a gift from God that may be tangible, emotional, or spiritual in nature. So we know from general research in positive psychology that general gratitude towards God tends to hold a stronger association with well-being compared to just gratitude for other things in life. So that there's a distinctiveness of feeling grateful to God or a divine power that's distinct from feeling grateful to other humans. So we might think that a student athlete who identifies as religious, and we know that on average, student athletes tend to be more religious than the broader college population, and they express gratitude towards God, they may tend to have a different perspective on life. They may be more thankful for their blessings. They may see them as a gift from God, view the ability to play sport and to compete in sport and to go to school as a gift. And this could really work to sort of fight against or overcome the pervasive collegiate sport culture that prioritizes achievement and winning and self-promotion and building a brand. Right. So with the student athletes confronted with the pressures and demands of their lives, espousing more gratitude to God could facilitate their awareness, again, of needing God and relying on God. And so what we do in this study is we propose that the association between gratitude to God and well-being among student athletes could be mediated by indebtedness to God, which is somewhat of a new measure in the positive psychology literature, as well as a fairly well-established measure of meaning and purpose in life. So just to give you a sense of transcendent indebtedness to God, this is a measure that's been developed by Janae Nelson and colleagues, and this sort of has a few different components. First, viewing God as a benevolent giver. Second, having an autonomous desire to repay God, but also understanding that God does not expect equal repayment for what he has given us, just loyalty and faith. And sort of, having this sense that we can never truly repay God, but wanting to feel God's love and reciprocate God's love by serving others. So taking our indebtedness to God and translating that into pro-social behaviors, taking focus away from the self and individual accomplishments and focusing sort of on the larger community. And then, of course, meaning in life, purpose in life, which is simply, understanding that we have a sense of meaning and purpose and that we're not sort of going around directionless. So does the association between gratitude to God and well-being work through these two different variables? So I'll present results on that. So the data set for this is a little bit different. So it's a 415 student athletes, which is a fairly large student athlete sample, which is part of a larger sample of about almost 2,000 college students who attended religious or secular institutions. The only condition for their inclusion in the study was they had to have an adjacent center for Christian thought. So these are anywhere, there are 14 different institutions across the United States. Some are R1, some are private Southern, some are in the Ivy League in the Northeast, some are small liberal arts colleges, primarily Division I student athletes, but some also Division III student athletes. This was the first time point. By the end of the summer, there will be 4 data collection points. So it will be sort of a really cool longitudinal data set with access to both student athletes and non-student athletes. So we look at fairly standard measures of depression, anxiety, and loneliness among student athletes. We use a well-established gratitude to God scale. Indebtedness to God, again, as I mentioned, sort of a new measure, but I've listed the items there. This sense of not being able to repay God, but trying to repay him through living a virtuous life, and then sort of having a greater sense of meaning in life and feeling that one's life matters. Those were our two mediators. So showing first here the results for the relationship between gratitude to God and our 3 measures of well-being mediated by indebtedness to God. So first, I think perhaps unsurprisingly, gratitude to God was associated with lower depressive and anxiety symptoms and lower loneliness in student athletes. Supplemental analyses also showed that the association between gratitude to God and well-being held even after adjusting for general gratitude to God, highlighting its uniqueness as a psychological construct. So to the extent that student athletes experience feelings of gratitude, they may say God is their co-pilot on their journey or actively involved in their lives, reassuring them that they don't have to navigate the pressure-packed world of collegiate athletics and academics on their own. We found consistent evidence here that indebtedness to God was a mediator. So I'll just draw your attention here to the last column. Indebtedness to God mediated anywhere between 18% to 34% of the relationship between gratitude to God and each indicator of well-being. So again, this crucial component of indebtedness to God is having the desire to pay God back, right? Which can also stem from having greater gratitude towards God, especially the desire to pay it forward with one's own actions, what we have already received from God. So feelings of gratitude to God could promote a greater sense of indebtedness and could help student athletes place less emphasis on performance goals and achievement, and instead focus on what they can do to reciprocate God's love in the world. Moving to our second mediator, we also see evidence that gratitude to God was associated with greater meaning in life, and that meaning in life also mediated here anywhere from 50 to 73% of the relationship between gratitude to God and each indicator of well-being. So gratitude to God could also play a role in protecting against any deficits in well-being for student athletes, by helping them find meaning in their hardship and embrace it in adaptive ways, right? So I think overall, the two sort of mediating pathways that we established really show that gratitude to God, to the extent that it helps athletes feel more indebtedness and greater meaning in life, could serve as these really vital coping tools for student athletes, and that in an athletic culture increasingly dominated by the pursuit of winning and money and building one's brand, religiosity really has an important place to aid student athletes in finding perspective and recharging themselves under conditions of stress, and sort of being able to place things in a larger perspective. Okay, so putting it all together, I hope what my talk has shown here today is the importance of integrating social stratification into the studies of virtue and well-being. And I think what this does is it leads to theoretically important insights about religious cognitions, about religious virtues, thinking about who they may matter most for, and under what conditions in society. The latter study, the third study, also suggests the need to study certain at-risk populations. Student athletes are one, but certainly, perhaps workers confronting burnout, high school aged people, confronting the challenges of navigating a world, dominated by social media, to sort of broaden the literature on religion, virtue, and well-being, and really show religion's utility in helping people deal with the challenges that they face in their life. And certainly it's my hope that as more longitudinal data becomes available to overcome the limitations of cross-sectional data use in the studies I presented here, that we can come to a more robust understanding and start to really sort out causal ordering in the relationship between religion, virtue, and well-being. And I think hopefully my talk has presented an argument and a sort of a utility in integrating sociological theory with already well-established research in positive psychology to expand the scope of what is possible. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to your questions.